class is about Purim. We're going to speak about the historical significance and the mystical significance of Purim and the main custom of Purim. Everyone knows the Purim story, the saving of the Jews in the time of the 4th century before Common Era, where there was a decree in the kingdom of Ahasuerus, and that Haman, who convinced the king that all the Jews should be killed. And Esther, who was one of the king's wives, along with Mordecai, saved the day and convinced Ahasuerus that Haman was wicked, and the Jewish people were saved, and Haman and his 10 sons were put to death. Beautiful Purim spiels are talked about. We read the Megillah every year. But few people know the significance of the holiday, both spiritually and historically. What happened at Purim that was so important? And again, we're going to talk about one of the major mitzvahs and interesting occurrences of Purim. Today's class is going to be based on Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, and he has a Torah on Purim in this book, and I'm going to add to it as well. I think it's a very profound idea that he speaks about on Purim. So it says in the Gemara Megillah, page 7b, Amar Rava, B'chayev inish lipsume l'purya ad lo yara ben arur Haman levaruch Mordechai. Rava says in the Gemara, every man is obligated to party on Purim until he doesn't know the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. Basically, this statement in the Gemara is the reason why people get so festive, let's just say, on Purim. Though we know already from the Megillah, it talks about the gifts and the celebrations that they would have on Purim. It's very strange to people who see Purim and see just what an absolute wild festival it is. People are partying, they're drinking, they're wearing wild costumes and dancing all throughout the night, and it's just a time of great festivities. It's something that you really just don't see any other time of the year, except maybe on Simchas Torah, but not in the same way. Simchas Torah is like a controlled simcha. It's like a simcha for the Torah. Purim is just a totally wild, bizarre day where you see the most serious people and the most lighthearted people get together and dance and party and drink and just have an incredible time on Purim. So what is this all about? Judaism is a generally serious holiday. We've had a very serious past, and the Torah is a very serious document which tells us all about our obligations in the world to God and to others and to ourselves. But yet we have this day like Purim, which is just beyond. What's going on there? So first of all, I want to speak a little bit about the historical circumstances of Purim. The Jews have been exiled from their land after Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians had destroyed the temple and took all the Jews and the vessels of the Holy Temple off into exile. The Babylonians were defeated by the Persians, and the king, Ahasuerus, was the monarch who ruled over the Middle East. And there was a prediction in Jeremiah and Yirmiyahu that the Jews would only be in exile for 70 years. The party that happened on Purim at the beginning of the story, our oral tradition teaches us, was a party that the wicked made in order to party the 70-year prophecy that the Jews would return had failed. Before this, there was an attempt to rebuild the Holy Temple, but that fell through and it was canceled out. Enter the Purim story. Anyway, after the Purim story, Esther remained with the king, Ahasuerus. She had no choice. She could have been killed. We know what a type of person Ahasuerus was. And they had a son, Darius. He became king Darius II. And he was Jewish. And through the influence of his mother, he rescinded the decree of the Beis Hamikdash to be rebuilt. And in fact, in that time, there was permission for the Beis Hamikdash to be rebuilt. And that's where we get the stories of Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, of the rebuilding of the Beis Hamikdash and what happened. So we see that it's not just an amazing story. It's amazing enough in itself that the Jewish people were saved from imminent destruction. But we see historically it also started a new era, an era which the Beis Hamikdash, the second Beis Hamikdash, would be built. And the Jews did eventually go back. And that's when the Hanukkah story happens. And the Jews had a second Beis Hamikdash, had a second temple for many years. So we see the Purim story, even though it's important in itself, it also has a historical significance as far as it was the turning event. Esther had a son with the king, Darius II, who ended up being the one who rescinded the decree and let the Jews go back and rebuild the Beis Hamikdash, the Holy Temple, the Second Temple. The last of the prophets was in the time of Purim. Mordechai, Esther, and others were part of a group of people called the Men of the Great Assembly. And this is a group of great rabbis and even prophets. They developed the liturgy that we have today, the customs, they brought the oral law forward. And from this point on, we don't see prophecy anymore. The Gemara tells us that at that time, there was idol worship in the world. And then the rabbis saw that it was so horrible that the Jewish people should be involved in the worship of all sorts of different objects in this world as opposed to just worshiping God, that they prayed that the desire to worship idols would stop, the Gemara says. But we know Zel u'mad zeh as Elokim, that God made one thing opposite each other. And because the idols lost their power in the world, God also took away prophecy. Because if we're going to take away the power of the dark side, the evil magic, the black magic of the world, which is found in the service of idolatry, you also have to take away the power of good. Because free will is the basis of human civilization and human life. And therefore, you can't have such a strong power as prophecy towards good and have such a power as dark magic and idolatry towards the bad. So the sages say that both were removed at that same time. And at that time, we moved to a different era. An era where we didn't have such a spiritual connection. Matter of fact, in the second temple that was built, the Holy Aron wasn't inside the Holy of Holies, where the Ten Commandments are kept. This was lost, or it was hidden. We did not have the same spiritual existence in the second temple. All these miracles were removed, because again, miracles and prophecy needed to be removed. It moved into a time of more rationality, of what we call modern history, where the miracles of the past were few and far between, and God worked in more subtle ways. As a matter of fact, this is why we don't see God's name in the Megillah. It's the only book, the book of Esther, where we don't see God's name throughout the whole Tanakh, all 24 books of the Torah. We only see one book without God's name in it. Yet it's a holy book, it's a sacred book. And this teaches us that these last mitzvahs of Purim, that things are going to change. It's going to be much harder to see God in the world. We can find God's spirituality, but it's much harder when we don't have an era of prophecy and miracles. The Gemara says, Hacham adif minavi. The rabbis were preferable to a prophet. At this time, the oral law blossomed. There was always the oral law, going all the way back to Har Sinai, when Moshe received the explanation, the oral law, at the same time he received the actual Torah, the written Torah. But now the oral law would be developed, and the rabbis would have supreme power to determine. And we see all sorts of different instances in the Gemara where the rabbis talk about the fact that even if a small little bit of prophecy occurs, nevertheless, the rabbis have more power now, that prophecy is generally dead and reduced to only what's called the spirit of holiness, Ruach HaKodesh. That can kind of appear in a strange way. We can get a little glimpse of prophecy. But generally, our connection to Judaism is much more rational. It's much more intellectual based in this era, in the era before Mashiach, before Messiah finally comes. Right? And we know in the era that when Mashiach comes, it says in Isaiah 11:9, the world will be filled with knowledge of the Lord, das, as the waters cover the sea. In the final days, this midah of das, which means connection, the connection between heavens and earth, the heaven and the heart and the head, will be throughout the whole world. God will no longer be just an intellectual concept, which philosophers argue about, but will return it back to the days of the first temple and even higher, where we feel God's presence everywhere in our hearts. Because das means connection, the connection between the head and the heart. That one day the whole world will be filled with the knowledge of God. So how does this connect to Purim? Because Purim is the holiday where we seemingly lose this trait of das. Back to our Gemara. We said that every person on Purim must get so festive, drunk even, that they don't know the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. Clearly, we know that Haman is the epitome of evil, and Mordechai is the epitome of good. That's clear. But in the future, in the world to come, we're going to see how everything was godliness, that everything was connected to God. As Ishbitzer said, it's only in our mind that we see the differentiation between things in the world. Really, God is one. Everything is included with the God. All is included in God. Purim is a little taste of that ultimate party, right? But the thing is, something happened. Something was built into the human existence. You see, when the world was created and Adam and Chava were created, there was this thing called the Eitz HaChaim, which was the true life, the true spiritual life, the Torah. It was the means to connect heavens and earth, our head and our heart, to connect up to God. But in order for us to receive reward, we had to do the right thing. There had to be a test, because we know that only things that we earn, that we have our free will towards, have true meaning towards us. And so God gave us a test, the test of the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra, the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. And this tree of knowledge of good and bad, all we had to do was not eat it. Just wait a day until Shabbos, and then everything will be connected. But God said, just don't do this. But we used our own minds, we used our own das, and we reasoned, we can be like God. We can know the difference between things. We can be on a higher level if we will have tasted sin, if we will have tasted darkness, and then return to the light. Let's taste the darkness first. Let's go have fun first, and then we will return to the light. But God didn't command that. God didn't command that. And we ate the Eitz Hadas. We ate this fruit, which brought us knowledge. And suddenly the whole world took on a very tainted lens where we used our own knowledge. It was all mixed up. And we didn't see things how they were. We saw things, we saw that we were naked. We saw that we were vulnerable. We didn't see how holy and spiritual we could be. We used our own mind, our own das, our own knowledge to figure out what God must want out of us, rather than just following the simple commandment that God should listen to us. So at that point, we fell and we were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And each one of us today is like Adam and Eve, plodding through the world. And when we do mitzvahs, we connect to God. We bring up the spiritual light of God. So how does Purim fit into all of this? Well, it says that on Purim, we have to get so inebriated that we don't know the difference between good and evil. We didn't really know good and evil until we ate the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra, the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. But when we drink on Purim, we have to get to the point where we realize it's all one. That we don't know the difference between good and bad. We don't know the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. Rav Aryeh Kaplan says it fixes the Eitz Hadas by drinking from the tree of knowledge and fixing it when God commands us to on Purim. We fix our das. We let go of our das. We put on a mask and we take off our masks, right? The Ishbitzer says when we wear clothes, we wear a mask. Not only does it cover up who we are, but also shows who we are, right? It shows what we want to be. So in Purim, we get rid of who we think we are. And that is helped by the festivities, where every person lets go of their sternness, their seriousness, and just has an incredible party and lets go of their das and just trusts God and knows that everything is exactly the way it's supposed to be. That's what das is. That's what knowledge of God is. And that's why in Purim, we have to get to this level, even just for a moment, where we don't know the difference between good and bad, that we stop rationalizing and justifying and judging everything like we do after we ate the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra. Instead, we fix that trait of das, the trait of knowledge, by realizing it's all up to God. I have to follow God. That's it. I get rid of this knowledge, this twisted knowledge that I have to judge everything and determine what's good and what's bad. And instead, I just let it all go and just totally become one with God in the world and just unite and dance and just celebrate and just don't know the difference anymore. You know, on Purim, it was by the sliver of a hair that we were saved. We don't even see God's name in there. We could have easily been killed. The whole thing was turned upside down. And that's the way it's going to be in the world to come. We're going to see that it all was God's plan, even though sometimes we don't see it. That's why we drink and dance on Purim, to let go of our suppositions, to let go of our knowledge and what we think the world should be, of our seriousness, and fix that trait, the trait of das, the trait of knowledge, to reconnect the heaven and the earth, which was sullied when Adam and Eve ate the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra. As a matter of fact, the Talmud gives 4 different explanations of what this actual fruit was. Even though people like to say it's an apple, there are 4 opinions. A fig, a loaf of bread, an esrog, and a grape. So we see that every time we eat bread and we have a Suda, a special meal on Shabbos, we can fix that. We can fix that bread. And when we make Kiddush, we can fix that grape. And Pesach we also do with the matzah and the wine. But here on Purim, our obligation is also do it. But maybe it's the highest in a way, because we directly leave that level of das and go to a higher level of das, or we don't know the difference, or we just let go of everything and become totally one and unified in God's presence. And even though we don't always see God and we don't have prophecies and miracles, nevertheless, we just connect to this God consciousness that we can find on Purim. And that's why it's the highest day. It's a day of redemption. Like Isaiah says, that one day the whole world will be filled with the knowledge of God. That's the level that we can get to on Purim. We can pray on Purim. It says on Purim that if you stick out your hand, someone should give you money. Right? It says that anyone who sticks out their hand, you should give money to them. And it also signifies that anyone who sticks out their hand, God will give them whatever they wish. It's a day of prayer and friendship and gifts and giving tzedakah. But most of all, it's a day just to let go and become one and accept and let go of everything that we think the way the world should be and realize it's just part of God's world. And that's the way it's supposed to be. This is Rabbi Adam Wah. Thank you very much. Have a great Purim.